Hi students, I am Professor Kshitij Bansal. I teach international law at Jindal Global Law School. We are going to discuss a very interesting, controversial at times, topic for today's module. It is use of diplomacy and anti-war propagandas. What are going to be the learning outcomes after this discussion? You would have an overview of different types and forms of diplomacy, especially the anti-war propaganda and their effect in mitigating wars and conflicts. By the end of the module, you will have a fair understanding of different roles that media and institutions play in influencing the decisions of state actors. I hope this has made you curious enough about this discussion. Let us begin with Introduction to Diplomacy. In the 21st century, diplomacy is concerned with altering and increasing from a secluded system of interstate relations to a common instrument of reporting among certain developing societies. In other words, it concentrates on solving issues arising in commonality among nations or its representatives. The topic of diplomacy has various issues with respect to international terrorism, peacemaking, economic and social upheaval, war and human rights. Thus, the term diplomacy has various meanings to it, one such being the use of political strategies to achieve a strategic edge and to discover possible solutions that can be used to resolve the issue in a well-mannered and cordial way. Renowned diplomat as well as a writer and politician, Harold Nicolson, has defined the term diplomacy as the management of relationship between independent states by a process of negotiation and the use of tact rather than force in gaining strategic or tactical advantage. It is necessary to look at the aspect of diplomacy from a common man's point of view. A common man is unaware of the methods adopted by governments to come to a conclusion, hence defines diplomacy as favoring someone by avoiding criticism and without any intention of being polite to the person to reduce the harshness of the reality. Margaret Thatcher's famous letter to South African President Botha to end apartheid is one such example of diplomacy in the real world, and that would be the meeting of British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and the South African President, as I mentioned, President Botha, which was held in Nassau, 1985. Prime Minister Thatcher, without dictating her terms to the leader of another country, asked for help in her stand against economic sanctions by urging President Botha to announce publicly specific steps which included the release of Nelson Mandela towards the end of apartheid. Various such examples could be cited to explain how diplomacy is beneficial towards a nation's resources as well as time. The 1961 Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations outlines the rules of diplomatic law for the exchange and treatment of envoys between states. Thus, in this aspect, certain diplomats are given the task of taking part in development of international treaties so as to avoid confusion which is created by nations' political influence, which is essentially done by politicians. Hence, the importance of diplomats has long been observed by the United Nations as well as the individual states. The rights of diplomatic agents have been recognized in the 1961 Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations. One such famous example of United Nations preferring diplomacy is the Soviet war in Afghanistan. The Pakistanis have never been keen towards a united resistance movement but have preferred to deal with the problem at hand with diplomacy, which left the Afghans to fight. To support this movement of Pakistan, United Nations, at its sponsored peace talks on Afghanistan, continued to exclude the party which posed resistance. Moreover, in Kenya, following the outbreak of post-electoral violence in 2008, the United Nations quietly provided strong support to the African Union-led mediation efforts that eventually succeeded in stopping the violence and resolving the political electoral conflict through negotiations. In the chapter following this one, we will talk about how diplomacy is more beneficial than war and what is the need for diplomacy. Diplomacy is beneficial to a nation in various different aspects. It helps the nation's representatives to take certain action to prevent disputes, to result into full-fledged or even minor conflicts, or to restrict the spread of conflicts when they take place. Huge amount of importance is placed on diplomacy due to the fact that war places a heavy burden on societies in the sense that it leads to a large number of lives being lost, as well as requiring costly security and humanitarian engagements, and most importantly results in everlasting economic damage on a country's economy. As stated by the World Bank, the cost of civil war incurred by a nation can degrade a nation's economic growth by 30 years. Another aspect of diplomacy is that in the face of crisis, diplomacy is the best option available to preserve peace. The nations have reached such a point that they are open to take the preventive steps to avoid any crisis, which can lead to reduction in economic growth. Diplomacy is not just a peaceful option to crisis or violence, but rather is an option to prepare or avoid war. What are we after? What are they after? Are the central questions revolving around warfare. What is a means to physically state nations' wishes by trying to clear away all the resistance arising in the process? Take the example of Ukraine. A false sense has been put forward that diplomacy has been beneficial in Ukraine, but for diplomacy to be useful, all the military conflicts need to be settled, isn't it? Evidence has suggested that despite all the reforms which are put in place, there is no way to fight corruption. Various international institutions have also pretended that Russia hasn't started a war which could disrupt international peace and order. Thus, it is necessary to think why diplomacy is necessary. In the 1900s, diplomats were given the status of honorary male men. If it recalls ancient Indian stories, whether or not true to your head, which brought about certain apprehension amongst the governments. But this never restricted the role of diplomats and diplomacy in the world. However, there arises certain personal factor which a diplomat needs to keep in mind to ensure good governance. François de Callière, a great Frenchman in diplomacy, once wrote, "The good diplomat must have an observant mind, a gift of application which rejects being diverted by the pleasures or frivolous amusements, a sound judgment which takes the measure of things as they are, and which goes straight to the goal by the shortest and the most natural paths, without wandering into meaningless and endless refinements and subtleties. The diplomat must be quick, resourceful, a good listener, courteous, and agreeable. Above all good negotiators must possess enough self-control to resist the longing to speak before he has thought out what he actually intends to say. He must have a calm nature, be able to suffer fools gladly, which is not always easy, by the way, and should not be given to drinking, gambling, or any other fantasies. He should also have some knowledge of literature, science, mathematics, and law. Does it ring some Game of Thrones bells in your heads? Diplomacy should be used as a tool to ensure balance of interest of the communities rather than balance of power. War is about power, whereas diplomacy is about influence. The diplomats should use such influence to search for compromise leading to resolving the disputes. The thought process of achieving everything or nothing leads to only war. The need for diplomacy is to look at a global picture rather than concentrating only on the national interest of the respective nation. Diplomacy is a crucial aspect of today's world, but it is useful only in the time of crisis. History has taught us today's government to initiate war to achieve what they want is a reality. However, what they have failed to observe by one of the most dreadful war, that is the Cold War, is that the use of military to solve conflicts should be limited. Diplomacy aims at promoting its nation's culture for long-term needs and acting as propaganda for a nation state by improving its image abroad, which will be beneficial to the state and which essentially cannot be a war propaganda. It not only promotes peace, but also demonstrates democracy. When the politics and diplomacy are not influencing a nation, it creates situations as one can see in Syria, Ukraine, and Iraq as of today. Therefore, diplomacy is really necessary and it does help to keep the world a habitable, peaceful place. What are then the arguments in favor of diplomacy in your mind? This briefing now would highlight the need for an open diplomacy as it is necessary for the growth of the world. There are many tasks of diplomacy which need to be done to ensure peaceful and efficient change. The first and most important function of diplomacy is representing its state's interest and conducting negotiations, keeping in mind the best interest of the nation. Finding a common interest is essential to be able to come up with a solution best suited to both the parties. The second function of diplomacy is to collect information, identifying the issues and evaluating the concerned state's foreign policy. The third function is to not just develop own national interest, but also to develop the political, economic, and cultural ties between both the countries. Take the case of US and Britain after World War II, when both the nations aimed their foreign policy at the extermination of communism, due to which today the United States State Department engages international audiences to speak about politics, security, and their values to help create an environment receptive to US national interests. Diplomacy wouldn't achieve you what you want when you want it. There have to be certain compromises and acceptances to work together to find innovative ways to attain common interests. It then brings in an interesting aspect that we must integrate diplomacy and social media. Social media has replaced various old traditions of late delivery of reports, inaccurate reporting, and so on, with timely and accurate reporting with pressure on diplomats to deliver the above, although this can itself sound very disputable. This shows that the development in social media and the huge level of involvement of people can push forward national interests. Social media is a platform for the citizens to put forward their views. It could vary from creating dissent to communicating live footages all over the world. Certain nations, to maintain their secrecy, used methods such as blocking their citizens' access to social media sites and ensuring no momentum is created to determine a people's movement to change its government or a government's policy decision. If you are thinking of China, you are on the right track. Social media has been a key player in promoting the interests of the citizens of nation. In the same manner, The main aim of diplomacy is to upgrade the interest of the nation amongst international system. A huge chunk of work carried out by diplomats is to influence their respective audiences about some or the other foreign policy issue. The job of a diplomat isn't restricted to just one state talking to another, rather it is to talk informally with their respective audiences also and influencing them and finding the best way out to carry out their functions. And what they found out is doing this through blogs is the best way. The task of a diplomat is to promote and pursue their country's interest. Blogs on internet written by such diplomats carry valuable information which may go unreported in the newspapers or televisions. This has been termed recently as public diplomacy. Public diplomacy comprises the efforts of the state to influence, inform and engage with foreign publics. The idea behind public diplomacy was for the diplomat to engage into a direct communication with other states' citizens with the purpose of influencing their thought process and subsequently of their government. The common word we used for all of this is propaganda. As the influence of mass media continues to grow, policymakers tended to utilize the media for their own benefit, publicizing what they wanted to publicize and taking positions on certain issues. Take the case of Al Jazeera TV. American government didn't want to attend Al Jazeera programs for several years as the program took a very hostile position towards the United States. However, after a while, State Department officials began actively participating in the Al Jazeera program as they came to the conclusion that any kind of publicity is good publicity. Moreover, they also realized that being on the show would give them a chance to explain their policies and achieve a better image. It didn't take long for the countries to realize that to have a smooth implementation of the foreign policy, it is necessary to be able to influence the citizens of the other nation as well as your own nation. Hence, various nations such as the United States, China, Russia, and European Union started concentrating more towards developing their global media to provide detailed, timely, accurate, and comprehensive information to the people all over the world. On this point, I must mention, India is not far behind. It has lapped up its lobbying efforts across the world. While technology could facilitate more transparent communication between the diplomatic community, the private sector, the world's foreign ministries may not always have the cultural, procedural, or the institutional disposition or the abundance of information derived from these tools to effectively integrate them into policy. In such scenarios, diplomats can go back to the traditional diplomacy. However, what is necessary is that an open platform is provided to both the public and the diplomat to choose the best recourse available to them. Anti-war propaganda would catch your curiosity much more than just diplomacy. The word propaganda refers to any method of disclosure in support of national purposes which aim to influence opinions, emotions, attitudes, or behavior of any group in order to benefit the sponsor, either directly or indirectly. As defined by Jowett and O'Donnell, propaganda is a deliberate, systematic attempt to shape perceptions, manipulate cognitions, and direct behavior to achieve a response that furthers the desired intent of the propagandist. The purpose of anti-war propaganda is to make people adjust to the abnormal condition. To make this process easy on everyone, propagandists have often represented warfare by using conventional visual codes already established in mass media culture. Media diplomacy concentrates on making the diplomat influence the foreign citizen. Citizen journalism is, on the other hand, similar to propaganda, where it focuses on the capacity of citizens to generate narrations with a specific truth claim, while at the same time avoiding the professional link with mainstream media organizations. Citizen journalism is a concept that allows enriching these participatory debates by emphasizing the potential of citizens to participate in the process of media production as non-professional journalists, thus disarticulating the need for professional employment in the media industry from the concept of journalism. However, none of these concepts are without some risks. Many a times the mainstream media have attempted to enter into the field of citizen journalism. One example of an anti-war propaganda could be when nearly a million people came on to the streets of London with the intention to protest against the war in Iraq, in which the British Army was pushed in by the then Prime Minister Tony Blair. Nearly 3 years later, people continued to protest silently by lining up on the streets to end the occupations. These weren't only protests. Multiple protests and actions took place during this period, which went on to show an upsurge in peace crusade in Britain and worldwide. Recently, the word information war has been put forward. Information war refers to constant reporting of events through the presence of thousands of journalists in the war zone. This reporting varies from blogging from the war zone or tweeting from the war zone or sending videos from the war zone. However, till date, most important medium for this information war has been television. Not long ago, people used to be dependent on radio and newspapers to receive notifications and information and visuals about the war. But today, with the introduction of new technology, people are kept up to date with all the news, information and visuals through digital media. Information war through internet does not involve huge amount of direct involvement of citizens, but citizens do experience vast knowledge and extensive reporting about the war. For example, James Meek, foreign correspondent of the year in 2004 for his coverage of Iraq war, felt that because reporters with the military did not have access to the accumulation of disparate reports that was available to listeners, readers and viewers in the UK, he missed the war because he hadn't seen it on TV. One of the essentials of information war is the anti-war and peace movements. They play a major role as they question the need for war, but at the same time they take a sense of the changing media strata and use it to make their presence prominent. Activities ranging from demonstration on streets or utilizing new media activities to achieve their purpose, information war encompasses various elements. During the times of war, when there is a lot of uncertainty and conflict, it is difficult to control the journalists, which lead to public interpreting information in different ways. Nowadays, where governments and military must seek legitimacy for their policies, the anti-war and peace movements play an important role. After discussing the importance and the relevance of diplomacy and a contextual discussion on anti-war propaganda, it would be fair to sum up by saying that various types and forms of diplomacy have ensured mitigating the overall irretrievable effects of war by use of compromise, mutual agreements, and a dialogue that allows parties to take reasonable decisions, mutually benefiting each other. It can also be said that conventions and treaties like the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, use of media diplomacy by corporations and newspaper agencies, citizen journalism and anti-war propagandas have come as instruments aiding to the cause of diplomacy. I hope this discussion has given you a good foundation to understand these concepts. Thank you.